So I just finished this book. It's called The European Union, A Citizen's Guide. It's by Chris Bickerton, who is a lecturer of politics at University of Cambridge. He's a fellow at Queen's College. And it was written in 2016, so this was prior to the Brexit vote in the UK. And my sense is that it's written very much for a for a British audience. Certainly, I would say that Chris is. I think that anybody who reads about the EU and really chooses to inform themselves about the EU cannot come to any other conclusion than that the EU is a kind of a necessary institution. The world would be far worse without it. I have written a few takeaways for anybody who feels like learning about those takeaways from me. I think that one of the things, so I learned about the EU originally just growing up in the UK, and the emphasis was on the EEC, the European Economic Community at the time, and it's kind of evolved now. We just say the European Union. Before the EEC, there was the European Steel and Coal Community, and the EU was sold to Brits at the time that I was in the UK as very much the European Economic Community. This was about ensuring free trade. And I've been reading a couple of other books in parallel. That was not the perspective, for example, of France or Germany, where the European Steel and Coal Community was very much there in order to prevent one or other country getting into a race in the production of steel and coal, which could make weapons of war, and kind of established a council in which the different countries that had been at war only a few years before could see what each other were doing, could verify and check. What's my point? My point is that so one of the things that one learns is that the way the EU is perceived in different countries is very, very different, and what the primary role is very, very different. But I think that a British person who kind of takes the time to inform themselves would develop a very, very different view. So first thing is that really ultimate control of the EU lies with the Council, and the Council, the Council, not the Council of Europe, which is a different organization. The EU Council is basically a group of the heads of state, of the prime ministers, the kind of legislative body, but I guess the country gets to nominate that person. It's the person who has the democratic mandate to run the country. So in France, it's the president. In the UK, would not send the king; they send the prime minister. And in that council, all the way up to I don't remember exactly when, there was no decision that could be made unless it was done by unanimity. And so the idea that, and in many areas still, decisions can only be made with unanimity. What's the point? It kind of drives home the point that control of this whole thing lies with the Council. And I did a stage at the European Union, and I kind of felt at the time like the Commission was the most powerful body in the EU. And the Commission of the EU does get to propose rules and regulations, but only within the areas of competence that the EU Council of Ministers has decided. So its powers in a way are limited by that. And yes, I think that I agree with Eurosceptics in the UK that the European Commission has been aggressive in seeking out powers, but only with the consent of the Council of Ministers, which is, I think, really, really important to point out. And the EU Commission, their primary goal for the majority of the time that they've been there has been to ensure a real free market. And then I guess I come to my second point, forgive me for the rambling, is that one of the things that happened in the EU is that the EU took a certain view of how a country should run itself. And so if you think of Russia after 1989, you had capitalism but without a social welfare state. And in a way, if you think of Russia before 1989, it was a communist state, and really, what do you call it? A social capitalist market economy, but with a welfare state, social welfare state with a capitalist element to the side that drives the economy, is kind of like the compromise that has been made in European countries. And that compromise, so we clear the decks for capitalism, but we ensure that everybody has access to healthcare, has access to good education, has access to decent paying jobs. So it's not unbridled, unlimited capitalism, but capitalism is enshrined, and support for the less well off, for the people who need social support. That is kind of the social compact that the EU enshrines into law. And by doing that, it kind of takes those issues it took, and I learned this, and I think that Chris does a great job of showing how those issues were taken out of politics and put into a legal framework. So the countries, by committing to the EU treaties, committed themselves to a certain way of running their economies. And when the Eastern European countries joined, they had a long way to go. They had quite a distance in terms of reforming the various institutions that they needed to reform in order to approximate the European model. So that was interesting to me, because what that does now is that when you take the kind of like the basic consensus about how economy should be run, now politicians are no longer arguing within their countries about a whole bunch of things, because those things are resolved in an almost legal process, in that they can't just go and give state subsidies to industries. They can't go and suddenly protect a certain industry. There are a whole bunch of things that they can't do because they've committed by treaty not to do it, and they've kind of settled that in place. Depending on which country you're from and what your political orientation is, will change how you orient yourself towards the EU. So a country like the UK, who's been a very pro-free trade country, I mean, I think people like Adam Smith, who started advocating for free trade, were from the UK. And so there's a natural bias towards free trade anyway. So it would be natural for somebody who's grown up in that environment to look at the EU and say, well, what kind of value does this add? We're a free trading economy anyway. But at the same time, somebody in the UK who's very much for a free market but doesn't really care so much for the support of the social welfare state would look at the EU and they would say, oh my gosh, look at them. They're imposing all these social costs on us. We don't want that. By contrast, somebody who's socially oriented, say in the UK, at a time when they could see that the EU was opening up markets and creating competition across the EU and making it easier for companies to compete across the European market, might have looked at the EU as a capitalist enterprise and found it threatening that way. So the EU, and I learned from this book, is really a kind of such a multifaceted, complex phenomenon that different people will see in different ways. And that was kind of, the book's been really, really helpful to help me to see that. So I have a couple of other points here that I hope I can read on my notes, which I can almost not read. Yeah, I think that just to end on a couple of points. So the EU was an incredible innovation, really. I mean, no group of countries created this kind of extra. So before we go to this innovation, what I realize is that you have a bunch of countries in Europe. Imagine that we disbanded the EU. Where are the countries' ministers going to meet and discuss things of common issue? For example, like handling migration. The many people are coming across the border, coming up from Africa, for example. How would those countries now seeking to control air pollution, where are they going to talk? So inevitably, they would have had to get together with their counterparties, because these are problems that go over borders. And so I ask myself, what would they do? Meet each time in an ad hoc way? Meet each time in a different city with a different host, with a different set of rules, with a different set of understandings? And so it seems to me one of the things that I realize is that the Council of the European Union is a talking shop for the ministers. Usually it's the prime ministers at the highest level, but it could be ministers with particular competency in particular areas. At the bottom, that Council of Ministers represents the combined sovereign power of the governments in whatever area of competence that they're meeting in. It provides an extraordinarily valuable place for these issues to be handled. And even if we were to press a button and to disband the EU, you would still need to find a place to meet. So why not use the existing structures? Another point is that it was not obvious after World War II, a point that Chris Bickerton makes, that the EU that nation states would reconstitute themselves. They were deeply destroyed. It was interesting that nation states put themselves together, but there was this clear need and desire to create these supranational structures. So yeah, it's been a fun book to read. I'm grateful to have read it. I've learned a lot. This was a pretty awful review, but it's the first that I've done. Maybe the next one will be better. Thanks for listening.